Tuesday, February 1st and 12 noon, we're ready to start our CMDA monthly meeting. I'm Sing Pallet, I'm the president of CMDA. We're going to start today's meeting with some announcements for some board members. I'll go ahead and start. Just wanted to remind everyone to save the date, April 29th, for the CMDA annual conference. We've decided to proceed with plans to make it in person at the Denver PPA Event Center. I'm very excited to have all sorts of great speakers. And next month, hopefully we will have hopefully very soon, actually, we'll be having the registration up online so you can join and look at the agenda. And please plan to spend the day with us. We're very excited. Now I'd like to invite Leslie Ebert to make an announcement also regarding our conference. We're very excited about a special project we're going to do related to the annual conference.
Thank you so much, Sing. So we would like to honor, we have a few pillars of our community who are retiring this year, and they have served us with grace and expertise. Our community wouldn't be the same without them. We want to make sure that we include anyone from our community who is retiring this year. So if you know someone who is retiring, please just feel free to send myself or Sing Pallet an email, let us know the name of the person, and we'll do a special presentation during the annual conference to honor these incredible members of our community. And so thank you.
Can't wait to hear who's going to be on that list. And next, Galen Hartsiker, he's going to make an announcement about the CMDA podcast.
I wanted to welcome everyone to come over to cmda.us and look for our podcast. There are two of them up there now. First one was regarding DVT, and second one is regarding psychotropic and what a PASSAR means and how to go about doing a psychotropic reduction. So feel free to hop on over and take a listen to it. And we're putting those out about every 2 months at this point, and that's our goal, is to keep it on topics that are very relevant that we all are dealing with. So check it out.
Thanks, Galen. Really wonderful work with that podcast. Dr. Fraser, did you want to mention the story?
Thank you so much, Sing. Good afternoon, everybody. At a QAPI meeting about 3 weeks ago, the executive director turned around to me in exasperation and asked me what I was going to do about the Paxlovid shortage in nursing homes. For want of I had nothing else better to say, so I told him rather flippantly I would write a letter to the Wall Street Journal, which I did and sent there and then. Much to my pleasant surprise, the Wall Street Journal published the letter, and they're going to send a copy to Sing and Leslie, and they'll forward it to anybody who'd like a copy. Also, ABC News picked up on the story, and they did a feature last week with input from both AMDA, ASCAP, and some private practitioners around the country. The interesting thing is that the idea that nursing homes should be prioritized for Paxlovid is beginning to gather steam. And so hopefully with the political advocacy of the relevant organizations, we may get more access to it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your advocacy for our patients. I will be very excited to send the letter out to everybody.
With pleasure. I've sent you the email already.
Oh, thank you. Very quick. Well, now we will turn to our partnering organizations for some announcements. And let's start with Chad Fear from the CDPHE. He's the section manager for nursing facilities. Hi, Chad. Thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Good afternoon. It looks like we've got a pretty full agenda here, so I'll keep my comments brief. Would like to recognize the staffing struggles that the facilities are going through. We too are having some staffing struggles between resignations and surveyors testing positive and not being able to go into homes. So want to just put out there, we want to be as reasonable as possible when we look at staffing when we're on an inspection. And we really are looking for patterns and how that's directly affecting the overall care that folks are receiving. I made a promise when I started, and I'll repeat it every opportunity that I get, and that is to be fair, to be reasonable, and to be understanding. I did a presentation with Telegen about CLAPI this last week. I think it was last week. Anyway, did recognize that we have cited CLAPI in about 9% of our recertification surveys. And here, with the 1135 waiver, we're looking at adverse events, infection control kinds of issues, and the adverse events, again, going back to that, looking at patterns of harm, immediate jeopardy, the kinds of things that facilities will want to pay attention to, and to hopefully identify non-compliance from themselves. In 2020, and this is the information that was provided by Telegen at the time, it was a 4-state region: Colorado, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Illinois. In 2020, we cited CLAPI more than any of the other 3 states. I think with the approach that we wanted to take, and again, being reasonable with our expectations, we ranked 3rd out of the 4 in 2021. So we're looking at that stuff, trying to understand the informatics around all of that. Again, we have had immediate jeopardy. And we've had conversations about immediate jeopardy. And again, they center around issues with infection prevention control, systemic failures, COVID-19 testing and those practices, and yet facility acquired avoidable stage 4 pressure wounds. We have just begun to look at the new tag F888 as of January 28th, looking for policies, looking to see that facilities are keeping track of who's vaccinated. And, again, then looking at the compliance with those requirements at 30 days, moving on to 60 and 90 to the future. Looking at the information, we've got 17 facilities here in Colorado that are near or below the 80% mark. And this data was a little bit, it was a week or so before the requirement went into effect. So I hope facilities are moving forward with that. There's the concern, particularly with those that are, below or just over the 80%, that facilities are counting all possible people, not just staff, but looking at contractors, volunteers, and those kind of things, and including that in their calculation. Just a quick rundown. I did look at some data across the states and our region, and we're pretty consistent with what we're citing here. Concerns with dignity, self-determination, and abuse. ADL care for dependent residents, activities, respiratory care has come up more significantly, and looking at, of course, staffing, dementia, and infection control. So we're seeing patterns there. Again, looking at that information for those areas that perhaps were higher than the national average, and trying to understand, what it is that we're seeing, and trying to, give perspective to all of that. So that's what I have to share with you today. And thank you.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks for kind of that bird's eye view. Jenny Albertson is here with CHCA. I don't know if you have any comments on what Chad said, and we'd also like to hear your announcements.
Sure. Just a little elaboration. Chad alluded to the new CMS guidance on vaccination programs and how surveyors are going to be inspecting those. I'm going to post in the chat an ACA quick little summary that they put out on their blog. As you all know, we are the Colorado chapter of the American Healthcare Association, and so we utilize their resources frequently. This is a really great little once-over summary plus some links to that vaccination protocol that they've released to surveyors. Along with that, interestingly, they've kind of allowed surveyors some discretion on suspending the dining task. That's now a discretionary and to be completed only if a resident is investigated for nutrition, weight loss, or facility incidents related to dialysis. Med storage also is now allowed to be a discretionary task, completed mandatory if there's an outstanding complaint or concerns from the ombudsman, or identified when completing medication administration task, which is not going away. And then resident counsel is also temporarily discretionary, but must be completed if there's again a complaint or something related to an ombudsman concern with regard to visitation or grievances, things of that nature. So just so you know, the surveyors are being given a little bit of flexibility by CMS in how they can make room for the new vaccination scrub when they go into a facility, because we know their load is pretty heavy when they go in for a research survey. So just thought that was interesting for you all to be aware of, so that you're not expecting a standard regular survey. And we know that the CMS folks are trying to recognize a little bit of a need for room. Additionally, let me kind of go over a few Colorado specific, CHCA specific things. The legislation that we're currently pushing for with regard to agency staffing is kind of trucking along. We shouldn't see anything resulting from that until the legislative session is up in April, I'm guessing. But just so you all know, we are utilizing examples from other states and kind of crafting our legislation for the price gouging issue based on what the current legislature is willing to entertain and will kind of help please a lot of different parties. So we're looking at ways to protect workers' ability to earn a higher wage. So we're looking at 150% of the normal wage charges being kind of the threshold for maximum charges before it's considered price gouging. That's in consideration. And we're trying to incorporate somehow both these like matching Uber style staffing services as well as standard agencies. So you may not be familiar with that, but for example, care.com, it's with a K. They're actually one of our associate members. They've created a platform where staff can become users of the platform, like an Uber driver would become an Uber driver. And it allows them to be matched to facilities. They star rate each other. There's a way to track their arrival, just like an Uber driver for their shift. It's a really cool innovation, but it means that we have the potential for some significant loopholes when we're just looking at a contract agency staff person, because these people aren't technically employed by these matching services. So at any rate, we're fleshing all of this stuff out to try to help our facilities avoid these exorbitant agency costs. And it also looks like the Colorado Hospital Association will be interested in some of this with us. So we're trying to make it broadly accessible to them as well for the benefits that might potentially happen by coming to some standards for industry use of temporary staff. We did have one semi-win legislatively. The department had requested $20 million to make enhanced provider payments. We're talking HCPF. We asked that they consider $48 million. We're talking about for Medicaid's funding specifically, which would be a $30 per bed day for 6 months instead of their original $20 million ask. On the 27th, the Joint Budget Committee did approve the $20 million for enhanced Medicaid payments to be dispersed in similar fashion to previous enhanced payments. But they also requested an additional $7 million to provide assistance to facilities with a high Medicaid census to try to continue to incentivize people to serve that part of our population. So they haven't clarified exactly what level of Medicaid census makes them be high, but they're proceeding onto the General Assembly with all of that. So, you know, it's additional funding. It's not relief funding per se. It's not through ARPA funds or anything like that that I'm aware of, but but it is additional Medicaid payments, and we all know that those underserve the facilities that are trying to meet multiple needs with the additional staffing costs. So at any rate, that was a little bit of a win. And then just a couple of other FYIs for you all. You may be very familiar with the issue of observation stays in hospitals, taking away an incoming resident's ability to qualify for an inpatient SNF stay. That's been through multiple court proceedings because people are complaining that they can't appeal when they've been made under observation status, and everything else in Medicare you can appeal when it comes to a benefit. So the court finally, through a final appeal, a 3-judge federal appeals court in Connecticut ruled that patients will be guaranteed the right to appeal for Medicare for nursing home coverage if they've been switched from an inpatient to an observation status before they leave the hospital. So it's not universally for everyone in observation, but it's for those that they at one time did consider inpatient, but they didn't make it through their 3 midnights to qualify them for Part A coverage. Basically, observation is a Med B benefit. It's considered outpatient, which means if you don't have Med B because you didn't subscribe to it, or you happen to be an immigrant and not qualify, then you can really be out a lot of money in a hospital. So this is really beneficial to our patients. I wanted you to be aware that that court case finally went through. It is on my blog in greater detail should you need it. And also just a quick clarification on the temporary nurse aid. A lot of people were very confused because the 1135 waivers were continued from the Department of Human Services extending the emergency. And it actually does not change our DORA program for temporary nurse aides. That still expired December 31st, but that program does include continued extensions up through May of this year if people continue to file for extensions on their temporary certification. They just have to apply through DORA, and they have to have met the initial deadline for the original TNA program. So I hope that all is helpful information. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks for those important updates. And feel free to share information about your blog in the chat. I'm sure people would love to follow you. And in the interest of time, we'll move on with our agenda. But if anybody has questions for Jenny, for Chad, for our board members, please use the chat function or reach out to the speakers directly. Right now, I would like to welcome Juliet Madsen with the CDPHE. She's going to present to us a very innovative program through the CDPHE for our healthcare workers with the crisis counseling program. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And excuse me, I still have frogs in my throat from when I was sick, so I kind of sound a little crackly. So let me know if someone can't hear me. I am the program coordinator for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Crisis Counseling Program. It's also known as the Colorado Spirit Program. Some of you might have heard of us. The mission of the Colorado Spirit Program is to assist individuals and communities who are dealing with the effects of natural or man-made disasters. We do that through community-based outreach and psychoeducational services. The CCP is a temporary program which provides free and anonymous mental health resources to anyone in the entire state impacted by COVID-19. We do this through collaborations with 13 community mental health partners who are covering all 64 counties in the state. Our teams do individual, group, and family counseling. For example, aside from individual and family counseling, we put on programs for groups such as reentry in COVID, COVID and stigma, a program called Many Voices, which is about how you can be heard or help others be heard during COVID. They also run programs around compassion fatigue, burnout, mindfulness and meditation. We have one program that does yoga. We do programs such as grief in the body and coping and handling reactions in healthy ways. We encourage positive relationships through programs such as Coffee Connections, which is just a once a week meeting where people can pop in and say how they're feeling and get support. And these are offered at multiple programs, not just at one. Our teams have provided emotional support to those experiencing reactions around vaccine hesitation, including anger, fear, and anxiety. We have psychosocial materials in the form of workbooks, tip sheets, handouts, magnets, all kinds of little reminders that people can put anywhere in their homes or businesses. We also participate in community events such as school fairs, winter festivals, resource drives, town hall meetings. Anywhere we're invited to, we can create a program for. We have done these things in parks, churches, museums, and then of course, in-person supports at small businesses, schools, and human services departments. Our team also helps individuals and groups find wraparound services so that folks can feel more in control. Things like housing and food scarcity, or employment and mental health services. So the Colorado Spirit program has been running for over 1.5 years and will be ending on March 27th of 22. But until that time, our programs are running at full speed, and we have many different programs you can choose from. We call that a menu of services approach, where a provider can reach out to us and ask for specific programs related to whatever your team needs. So you name it, and our creative teams can do it. As for our teams, you might want to know the makeup of the teams. We have everything. We have child and family specialists who are trained to work with younger clients and their families. We have senior specialists who work with the elderly, and then also with the healthcare workers and caregivers of those elderly. We have community liaisons who help navigate resources and provide more generalized support. And then we have crisis counselors who do the psychoeducation and meet with groups where they are when they need it. So how do we do this? We have services in roughly 100 languages. We work with significant communities or specialized communities such as Latinx, Native American, Black and African American communities, LGBTQI, foster parent programming, refugees and immigrants, military and veterans, homeless, and that's just to name a few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was I meant to share your slides, or are you getting to that?
If you don't mind, that would be great. If not, I can do it. Either or.
No problem.
Yep. Now, I know I said the program was ending, and usually when I say that, people turn their brains off and don't want to hear anything else. But we also have another program, which is specific to healthcare workers. So before I go on, this first slide is all about the CCP and the programs and offerings that we have. On the next slide, we can tell you about the Healthcare Worker Retention and Resilience Initiative, where we work specifically with healthcare workers, caregivers, healthcare support staff who are really struggling. So this program was born out of the idea of the CCP. We do many of the things that the CCP does, with a few exceptions. We have a peer-to-peer program. We have leadership training and development, and a library of services. And that library of services is very much the menu of services that the CCP has. But the idea behind the Healthcare Worker Initiative is to approach it from a top down and a bottom up approach to try and capture and support as many healthcare workers as we can. Of all of these programs, we have a team of subject matter experts, and we also have an advisory committee some of you might know of. It is a four corners support. We use those inputs to help us create our programs. We also have partnerships with places like UC Anschutz, Path for EMS, Grit for Responders, RISE, to help the healthcare worker program be as full and supportive as possible. On this website that you see, you'll find the literature review, which is all about the impacts on retention and resilience for healthcare workers, which discusses concepts like moral distress, compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma, and they're all spoken about it in a context of healthcare worker and COVID. You'll also find on the right-hand side of this website a resource tool, which can help you narrow down specific resources which would help you personally or your overall organization. So this you can use whether you're just there to tool around and see what's going on for you, or if you really think that you could create something bigger for your program. On the next slide, this is an example of activities programs have created so far. This is just something that folks use with daily challenges and can be used as kind of a screensaver or a handout, a poster, and it just asks folks simple questions. Did you take a walk today? Can you build a fort outside? And some of these may sound kind of silly, but we've gotten feedback that families of healthcare workers and public health officials have really been able to do this as a group activity. On the next slide, there's an example of, and I apologize, it's very wordy, but I wanted to make sure you could kind of see the full concept of what they do. This is from Mental Health Partners. This is one of our programs. They run programs all the time. What's listed here is not their entire menu of services. I didn't put in here anything that was that was specific to a hospital or a clinic or something like that. But you can see that they do all kinds of services, and they're even available on Eventbrite. So they try to find different ways to reach out to people. And then the final slide is a series of resources, which is, of course, not extensive by any means. It's just the tip of the iceberg of things that I have available. So you can reach out to your teams with more resources. So whether you're in need of support for hotlines or peer-to-peer programs, psychoeducational training like psychological first aid and suicide awareness, we have support programs for you and your coworkers. I encourage you to consider attending any of these programs, but the ones that are really strong are burnout, compassion fatigue, and resilience. The CCP and the Healthcare Worker R&R Initiative offer our services and tell you that you can do this and it's okay. You are not alone. I did see in this, in the chat that there was a question asking if frontline staff can join these programs. Absolutely. We have, because we are a statewide program and because we are hoping to make as many impacts on healthcare workers, the definition for that has, for our purposes, been expanded to include funeral and morgue workers, EMS, anyone in a hospital or clinical setting, down to even their IT folks, because we know that the pressures are not just in the ER or in the patient's room, but it's everyone who impacts them. All of these programs are free. So if you think that you have a program that would be, you have a group rather, that you think would benefit from a program, you can reach out to me and we can tailor a program specifically to you. Meaning if your team, you're working in a nursing home and your team is extremely burnt out and they're starting to not show up because they're sick and they're emotionally drained, and they're starting to perhaps get a little snappy with their clients. We can sit down with you, talk about the things that you're seeing and what you need, and then we can create a program where we come in once or we come in several times and support you.
Thank you, Juliet. Thanks for all those wonderful initiatives. I will be happy to send out the slides with all of the resources to our members. But in response to Leslie's question, is there a direct, or what would be the most direct way to sign up for one of the programs for a frontline worker, for instance?
So right now, the healthcare worker R&R program, the best way would be to reach out to me, and I can kind of determine what needs there are, and we can move from there. With the CCP, here I can put down a website for the CCP that folks can look in their county to determine who they need to speak with or how they want to speak with someone. So let's see.
Thank you. Appreciate that resource.
Absolutely. So here's the CCP's website.
Right there in the chat box. Thank you. Yeah. And if other people have questions, please feel free to direct them to Juliet or contact her directly. And while we're thinking about your questions, I'm going to go ahead and invite our next speaker, Travis Neill, physician assistant. He has prepared a nice presentation for us on a fascinating topic about bias and rooting for the null hypothesis.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Could you hear me before? I'm going to share the screen. I just couldn't tell if it worked to hear me.
We can hear you now.
Okay. And how about now?
You sound great.
Okay, very good. All right, I'll get moving. So the title of this is called Rooting for the Null Hypothesis. It's kind of a little cheeky title to talk about bias in medicine. I really found this topic very interesting, and I think it's relevant, particularly right now, for a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is, in medicine, really the stakes are a little higher than in other fields for us to become aware of our biases and try to mitigate for their effects when it comes to decision making. But the other reason, I think, is because of COVID. And I think, for the past couple of years, we have seen, medical information and, biases and cognitive dissonance really enter the zeitgeist, with social media and the effects on us as providers. But really, I think bias has become an even more important topic to highlight, not only for our own decision making, but maybe to highlight for other people as well, when bias is playing a major role. And really to play on the idea that our medical decision making can be improved if we recognize that we all process information through our own beliefs and attitudes. So if we can learn to become aware of those beliefs and hold them light enough so that we hear contrary information better, then we'll make better clinical decisions. So a couple definitions. Bias are any factors that sway judgment in a particular direction, often thinking in a way that leads us to be wrong. Bias is formed through a complex set of emotions involved in a set of beliefs. So they're really our own beliefs and attitudes about things. And the stronger our emotional connection to them, the stronger the bias will tend to be. That's true with either a past experience that created a certain belief, or our current emotional state plays a big role in how much bias can affect our decision making. And then there's cognitive dissonance. Definition is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes. Good example of that in the current climate would be someone perhaps that believes that the COVID vaccine is more dangerous than COVID itself. That person then, when they receive new information that is contrary to that belief, particularly if that belief is held highly or highly emotional, then they will immediately feel cognitive dissonance. And dissonance is in itself very uncomfortable. And so then we immediately do things that that work to reduce that dissonance, and things like justifying and rationalizing, basically to alleviate the discomfort that we feel as a result of it. So, I think the concepts of bias and cognitive dissonance are kind of fundamental things that we all experience all the time, that are really important to highlight and understand so that we can better account for them in our own decision making, as well as when we are evaluating scientific evidence and new information from patients. So there's really two types of bias. So there's explicit bias. This is bias that we're all aware of. It's at the conscious level. An example of this that I hold is when I have advanced care planning discussions with patients, I will tell them that I have a bias toward do not resuscitate for patients that are typically over about 80 years old. It's at the conscious level. It happens to be an example that I choose to express to patients because I feel like it's in their best interest, but I'm aware of those. Implicit bias is really the sort of insidious bias that I'm going to talk about in this talk that I think we need to look for ways to try to become aware of, and these are at the unconscious level. So these are based on our values and belief systems, and it's below the surface, and so we're not aware of these. So the two main areas of bias in medicine, and I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides quickly in the interest of time, but this one, gender and race, this in terms of systemic bias, evidence suggests that we have issues, for example, with evaluating pain with both women and people of color. But given that I am a white male, I am uniquely unqualified to talk about this. So I am going to kind of skip through this quickly. The good news is that it's getting better, but it's important to realize that it still exists, and that as a result, bias training is now a much more prevalent part of medical schools. And I think providers really like to believe that they don't harbor unconscious biases, but research continually shows that we do. And it's not that it's intentional. It's not that there's racism and sexism involved in the decision making. It's that at the unconscious level, as a result of our experience or lack of experience, there's certain biases that we're not aware of. And at least according to a number of studies, as it relates to gender and race, women tend to be sort of tagged, and again, these are generalizations, but their style of reporting pain, for example, tends to be more narrative based, whereas men tend to talk about pain in a more factual basis. And the narrative, which tends to have stories and more adjectives and emotions involved in it, that tends to be less believed as less credible. Again, that's generalizations. It's not right. But it's just kind of an issue between the genders that, as a result of, according to several studies, women don't receive pain medication or are given as many diagnostic tests when they report pain, when studied in emergency situations with abdominal pain, back pain, things like that. So first impressions. So as clinicians, our first impressions are really important. So they have a big impact on our diagnosis and decision making. So the first impressions are really our stereotypes, and they're kind of snap judgments that we all make. And they're important because it's actually a mechanism we all use to process or simplify the information we receive. We need these stereotypes in order to process information more quickly. It's a normal part of first impressions and processing information because it helps us reduce the amount of processing that our brains have to do. Often these judgments prove to be true. The problem is that they also always lead to forms of confirmation bias. So this could be in the form of a patient's appearance, their list of medications, their allergies, medical history, or simply if they remind us of someone else we know. But from the moment that we have our first impression, we will subconsciously seek information that confirms our initial judgments, and then we'll dismiss or downplay information that opposes those judgments. And we all do this regardless of our awareness of our own bias. We also will reinterpret information we receive in order to justify decisions we have already made. This is particularly important in situations where we've made a diagnosis and we've prescribed a new medication, for example. And so, the evidence says that providers sort of notoriously overestimate the benefits of the medication and underestimate the adverse effects. And this is just a sort of a normal part of our information processing. And there are a number of reasons why we do that. In another area where bias is really important to become aware of is in admitting mistakes. So medical culture really encourages providers to avoid admitting mistakes. It's kind of the perfect storm of a culture of that sort of promotes confidence or even arrogance. There's a fear of lawsuits. There's a fear that we are going to lose trust if we admit mistakes. There's the shame associated with it, and then of course ego. I think one of the reasons is, providers, we really view ourselves as well-intentioned, educated people who would never intentionally do any harm. So the moment that we receive information that one of our decisions may have done harm, it creates that cognitive dissonance, and we will immediately look for ways to sort of justify and rationalize that. Admitting these mistakes, even if it isn't always to the patients, but admitting them to someone, is really how we learn best from those mistakes. And the evidence actually says that the more that we admit our mistakes and even apologize for things that we've done wrong, it actually avoids lawsuits and gains trust with patients. Cognitive dissonance, again, it's done at the subconscious level, and it's sort of a subconscious reduction of discomfort. So the self-justification, motivated reasoning, defensive selective perceptions, a fancy way of saying that we essentially massage the information that we get in order to better align with our existing belief system, and it's a defensive posture. Problem is, it leads to distorted thinking, blaming, and an escalation of a commitment to an incorrect course of action. So it's particularly problematic with, sort of long-standing practices that, we have an attachment to. We actually identify with some of these treatment decisions, and over time, as the evidence builds, it creates dissonance, and we're more likely to sort of dig in and become defensive and justify those decisions. And if we don't admit, then we won't learn from our mistakes. So blind spots, we all have blind spots. Like this quote, the greatest faults, I should say, is to be conscious of none. So the worst blind spot is to think that you don't have a blind spot. An example that I have is with COPD or the use of oral prednisone. So my father actually passed away in 2012 from end-stage COPD, and he was on. Hold on. There we go. He was on oral prednisone for about the last year and a half of his life. And he tried several times to reduce the dose and was unsuccessful. He felt better. He had, better symptoms on the prednisone. What I didn't realize at the time was that I had formed a bias for oral prednisone with the use of chronic COPD. And presumably from my experience with my father and sort of the emotional connection associated with it as well. Well, this went on for quite a while, where I began prescribing oral prednisone for pretty much all of my COPD patients. And this was in spite of, good-meaning medical directors and colleagues kind of pointing out that this was not, recommended in the GOLD guidelines. And I knew this, but it was a huge blind spot. And I really didn't become aware of it until I was actually a researcher on a COPD study where I re-reviewed the GOLD guidelines. And then I also reviewed the treatment plans for a whole bunch of patients that were not my own. And suddenly it highlighted this blind spot. And it was really startling to think that I was sort of immersed in the evidence and I knew what the right standards of care were, and yet I still went against that because of this blind spot. It was good in the sense that it really highlighted how bad a blind spot can be. Of course, I changed my prescribing habits, and it also really brought me made me more open-minded to bringing in dissenting opinions, bringing in other colleagues, and sort of reevaluating a lot of my decision-making. The truth is, the more entrenched we are in our fields, the more knowledgeable we become, the harder it is to walk back from something that we believe to be true. So we typically tend to dig in and justify, especially with really important decisions. And then, our current emotional state will definitely affect our ability to see blind spots. So, if we're angry or frustrated, we will be even more defensive and less likely to see our blind spots. So I'm going to kind of skip through this, but there is a lot of bias in medicine. There's commercial funding and now dominates research, and most of the cited articles. Publication bias is a real issue where it's currently accepted practice for, let's say, a sponsor of a study. Let's say they do 12 studies on a certain drug, all with the same protocols, and let's say 11 of those studies show non-significant results, but one shows significant results. They don't have to publish the 11 that showed the non-significant results. They can just publish the one that showed the significant results. But that dramatically skews the importance of that one study with those significant results. As a result, you have a publication bias in medicine showing overrepresenting positive results over negative results. And one of the issues with that is data ownership. There's a bias towards new drugs and devices. Research rarely compares to lifestyle interventions. It's things like meditation aren't really as accepted because they're not amenable to scientific investigation, and knowledge is really determined by the market rather than just shared values. So just be aware, there is a lot of bias out there in the research and the evidence, and there are ways to sift through that evidence and try to identify, at least in the form of like underpowered studies, with low N values, basically times when, they're marketed heavily, but they're not based on a tremendous amount of evidence. So what are some challenges in nursing homes with bias? One of the challenges is there are a lot of personalities. So we have, all the staff, the patients, families, and so everybody has their own bias that they're carrying with them about all different kinds of things. And so all the information that we're getting is sort of filtered through all the different biases, in addition to staff perceptions of us can dramatically affect the quality and quantity of the information we get. A good example is, just arrogance in general. A staff member, if we've made a diagnosis and we've prescribed a certain medication, and we come across as arrogant, staff and patients are less likely to give us evidence that's contrary to that diagnosis. They're more likely to tell us things that we want to hear, and that is just human nature. Even if it's against their best interests, it has to do with our own perceptions and our own biases. The trick is that, patients and staff want a provider that's confident in their decisions, but the best decisions always leave open a seed of doubt. Arrogance will create more dissonance and more bias. So there's a balance to be had. Basically leaving, at least with our own decision making, leaving open that seed of doubt and being open to challenges or dissenting information. So that's the bad news. The good news, there are ways to mitigate for all these biases. We are all subject to bias. The question is how often it happens, and are there ways to mitigate the effects to improve our decision making? First is just awareness. So actual bias training. You could talk about bias in nursing homes to the staff, bring up studies, or just talk about the concept in general. Peer-to-peer constructive criticism is probably my favorite and the most effective way I find, where to get a small group of colleagues where the entire purpose of your discussions are to challenge each other and invite dissenting opinions. Even in the best of scenarios, it is hard to offer criticism to a peer unless that's kind of the pretext, unless they're invited to do so. So really kind of creating that small group of people that you can bounce ideas off and bounce the evidence off and decision making, and then just being open to and inviting opposing opinions, asking nursing opinions. There are many nurses that are very experienced and have seen a lot. And even though it is not their job to diagnose and treat, they're doing it all the time. And so often they just need to be asked. And it's additional information for us, even though we're the ones making the final decision to make those decisions. The other basic concept is separate the doing from the being. Big reason why people become defensive and rationalize decisions is because we see those decisions as defining who we are as a person. Back to seeing ourselves as good people that are educated, well-intended, making good decisions. And so we need to separate that from our sense of identity. It's not, a good provider isn't one that doesn't make mistakes. It's how you manage those mistakes and learn from them. So making decisions with information we had at the time that later turns out to be harmful doesn't make us, bad people. We have to separate those harmful decisions from this judgment on ourselves that it makes us a bad person. And it comes down to the idea of, what you did versus what you are. And, it's much better for us to then be able to admit mistakes and accept information that's contrary to our current beliefs. Algorithms and standards of care. So, Atul Gawande wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto, all about how checklists can help mitigate for bias in medicine. The Johns Hopkins blood clot prevention checklist is a great example of one where they had no intention, they didn't even think about bias when they created the checklist back in 2006. But when they looked at the data, they found a huge discrepancy between men and women for prescribing essentially medications to prevent blood clotting. And when they initiated the checklist, it took away that bias, and there were no more discrepancies. Pre-established tripwires, so criteria for when to stop a treatment, have pre-established. And then one of the big ones that I emphasize a lot is to document our decision-making, particularly when it goes against certain criteria or against the standards of care. There's something very powerful about actually putting it in writing, and that often highlights the bias. So you can actually see it happen right in front of you if you document it. We're so busy sort of rationalizing and justifying that the act of putting it down, particularly in a progress note, will often show you that, you may have a bias. And, asking questions like, what else could this be? If I'm wrong, what harm might this do? And what evidence is there that I may be wrong? A good gauge, a general gauge when processing information is how comfortable it is. So if it makes you uncomfortable, that is a sign that you might be dealing with cognitive dissonance. And you should pay attention to that and actually sit with the discomfort and pay attention to it. And you may be receiving information that is good factual information, but it happens to be contrary to your current beliefs. And again, the goal is to have passionate beliefs, but hold them lightly enough to be open to conflicting information. That's it. A lot of references. And I'm going to turn this over because I think we're running low on time.
Thank you so much, Travis. Thanks for putting that all together. It's a very big topic. And I noticed that I have the original slides that there are many slides with references, so this is very well referenced. Thank you so much, and congratulations on your upcoming publication on this topic. We look forward to reading it. Our last speaker today is Dr. Clay Watson with Optum at Home. Proud to call him a colleague. I think on Friday we were trying to come up with a title for this section of the topic and came up with something like current comments on COVID in Colorado, comments by Clay.
It's too many C's. Well, I don't know that I'll shoehorn it all in. I can just show you some things, but one thing I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of, we have a huge upgrade at Optum. And that comes in the form of Dr. Singh Pallet, who is the new medical director for Colorado and Utah for complex care management. So she'll be taking over for our iSNP and iESNP products. And I'll be moving over to a product which is called Optum at Home. Similar goals of care, and we'll be doing that in patients' homes. So welcome to Dr. Pallet to Optum, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can squeeze in just a couple big updates here. Can everyone see my screen?
It's coming up now.
Okay. Okay, COVID comments by Clay. I'm going to skip this one. Other than to say, look how narrow this spike was in South Africa. And that is their Omicron wave. And that is the most hopeful thing. This is sort of the time delay. We weren't so bad. The darker the color, the higher the case count per 100,000 population. You can see we went from December 14th, not so bad. That's right when Omicron became dominant, to just last week, January 25th, and it was everywhere, and everything was bad, and the sky was falling. This is Colorado specific data. You can see that Omicron really became dominant right there around 12/19, 12/20. So that's when Omicron took over. So it's only been, a little over a month, right? But we can see we've already peaked. The blue is peaked states. The red are not quite yet peaked states, and Colorado is in the blue. Very hopeful. This is our data from a great website, USA Facts. Just a few months of data, and you can see we have a bit of a fatter peak, but overall we're on the downslope, right? Here it is right out of the New York Times, and we had this high peak and a skinny peak when you compare it to all time. Cases are down, hospitalizations are down, and deaths typically lag a week or two behind that. So good news all around in terms of COVID, right? Most of this stuff so I can forward the slides. It is more infectious. It is less severe, far less severe. It does have some vaccine and immune evasion, but the booster did improve vaccination. The red part here, Regeneron and Eli Lilly's bamlanivimab etesevimab don't work. Oops, typo. Sotrovimab does work, right? 85% relative reduction in risk. Unfortunately, we just can't get it. If you want to see how much we're getting shipped, you can go to this website here, right next to treatments. That shows the distribution of the therapeutics. So Trovimab, also Paxlovid, and Molnupiravir. A pitch to don't forget about Evusheld, because it's pre-exposure prophylaxis. Here's some antiviral information. You guys know it. I'll send it along. You can read it as you wish. Really cool study on who will get long COVID. It's short and it's sort of a predictive model. I would encourage you to just glance at it because it really deals with our population. It gives a symptom-based and biomarker-based predictive model for who will get long COVID. And then, you know, there's data coming out on new treatments. Large trial in Japan says ivermectin works. University of Minnesota has closed its trial on ivermectin, metformin, fluvoxamine, should be out in a month. And the Oxford Principal trial on ivermectin and favipiravir also should be out soon. That was quick. We really went through that quickly, but I'll give these slides to Sing and she can give them to you. As always, I'm happy to field questions or you can email me. And it's good to see everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Clay. It's always good to have infectious disease specialists in our midst too. So please feel free to direct any questions to Clay, and I will send out these slides to everyone on the list. Thank you all for joining us today. Yep, Dr. Weaver has a question there. Maybe you could take a moment to answer that too, Clay. But for everyone who might have to leave at 1 o'clock, we thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to having you at our next monthly meeting, which will be Tuesday, March 1st. Thank you very much. Clay, there are a couple questions in the chat box. I don't know if you have a moment.
Yeah, I see them. So the ivermectin, ivermectin's weird, right? It's, and let's compare it to hydroxychloroquine. I would say on balance, its studies are about 50-50 for hydroxychloroquine, but there are a lot more small studies that hint at a benefit of ivermectin, but not enough data to start using it. Not enough data to start using it. Let me say that one more time. So I think these large trials, right? The one from Japan, it's not published yet. They've just said there's a benefit. So the one from Japan, the one from the University of Minnesota is gigantic, and the principal trial is also quite large. So what's exciting is I don't care either way. I don't have a dog in this race or a horse in this race or a dog in this fight. I don't care. It's, I just want an answer. And I think hopefully these 3 trials can put it to bed. So it'd be great if we could use it, if it's beneficial, but at least we'll know.
Good, thank you. Does anyone else have any follow-up questions? Okay.
Can I ask one?
I'll go ahead.
Clay, I think I just sent this to Leah Watson, but not to everyone and not to you, sorry. Do you think that the South variant of Omicron will delay our decrease in cases in Colorado or nationally?
Yeah, awesome. So that's the B2 variant, sub-variant really. There are mathematical models showing, Leslie, and so if you look in some places in Europe, they're projecting that there are more cases. The problem with the subvariant is stealth Omicron is what it's called, is it's hard to detect, right? So it's hard to get completely accurate numbers. And in the US, we think it represents about 8% of our Omicron cases. They're saying that it's maybe 1.5% times more infectious, but no more symptoms, so no worse symptoms, right? So the good news is it doesn't hurt us more than current Omicron, which doesn't hurt us at all compared to Delta, near as bad anyway. And so that is really the thought. Maybe this thing will extend the peak a little bit, but they're so similar that immunity to one, so if you had Omicron, you should be immune to the stealth Omicron. So maybe a little tail, but not, it won't really broaden that peak out.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hey, and I'll just throw in that by the time Omicron leaves, the projection from the university is that 80% of Coloradans will have had Omicron.
Wow. So if you didn't have Omicron, I will give you $5 and ask you to go get my lottery ticket, because apparently
Yeah,
you've got some luck.
Go hide.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you fielding the questions, Clay.
Sure.
Thank you everyone for asking them. All right, have a great day. Look forward to seeing you at future monthly meetings. I put a link in the announcement in the chat box about the Geriatric Journal Club, which will be this Thursday. And that'll focus on COVID-19 therapeutics also. We look forward to that great discussion.
Thanks, Sing.
Have a good day, everybody.